Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to crack open this book called The Box by Mark Levinson,
Hmm.
and it's a really fascinating look at the history of something that you probably don't think a lot about, which is the shipping container. But trust me, this is not just about boxes. It's about how this simple invention, like, completely revolutionized global commerce.
It really is amazing how something that is so ubiquitous can be so overlooked. We're so used to seeing these containers stacked on ships and trains and trucks, but very few people really realize how revolutionary they actually were.
Yeah,
Yeah.
before the 1950s, like, imagine a world where every item that you buy traveled across oceans in this. Just chaotic jumbles on the docks, moved by hand. Levinson paints this really vivid picture of sacks and barrels and crates and even coils of lumber just piled high. It sounds more like an obstacle course than a shipping operation.
Yeah, and that inefficiency had a huge impact. Shipping costs were just astronomical back then, really eating into the price of everything. And plus, that the unpredictable labor needs created instability for businesses and dock workers alike.
Yeah, the book mentions that, like, moving goods from Chicago to Europe could cost over $2,000 per truckload in 1960, with like half of that just for loading it onto a ship.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling to think about, like, how expensive and how slow global trade used to be.
Imagine the implications. That cost barrier meant so many goods had to be produced locally. It's hard to fathom how different our world would be without the efficiency that containerization brought to global commerce.
Yeah, it's crazy. Enter Malcolm McLean,
Hmm.
a trucking entrepreneur who saw this mess and thought, like, there has to be a better way. What's so fascinating is that his background in trucking gave him this, like, really unique perspective.
Yeah, McLean was obsessed with efficiency. He was constantly looking for ways to streamline his trucking operations. So when he saw all of the inefficiencies of traditional shipping, all those countless hours that were wasted loading and unloading, he knew there had to be a way to just like bypass all that handling.
Totally. And that led to his aha moment. Why not just put entire truck trailers directly onto ships?
It was such a brilliantly simple idea, but it had really profound consequences. Eliminating all that handling of individual packages meant you could drastically cut costs, you could drastically cut time, you could cut risk. And by standardizing container sizes, you could create a seamless system for transferring goods between trucks, ships, and trains.
Yeah, it's like we take that for granted now, but
Yeah.
that was huge. McLean wasn't afraid to take risks either. In 1955, he bought a shipping company. Pretty audacious move, and
Yeah.
started putting his vision into action. But as you might imagine, it wasn't an easy road.
Disruptive innovation rarely is. He faced resistance from established shipping companies who saw containers as a threat, and also from dock workers who feared for their jobs.
Yeah, there were so many powerful interests aligned against him. Levinson describes some pretty clever legal maneuvers that McLean used to, like, overcome these obstacles.
Yeah.
He basically had to outsmart the regulators to make container shipping a reality. He was a true visionary, but also a shrewd businessman.
Absolutely. He exploited loopholes in regulations to gain control of both a trucking company and a shipping line, which was something that was unheard of at the time. That strategic maneuvering was really essential to his success.
So while he was battling the old guard, McLean was also transforming the landscape of cities. The book really focuses on New York City, where the traditional piers on the Manhattan waterfront were simply too small and outdated for these massive container ships.
And this shift had major consequences. The rise of container terminals in New Jersey, which was driven by their ability to handle these larger ships, it led to the decline of those iconic dock worker neighborhoods in Brooklyn. It's a reminder that even the most positive innovations can have really unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's a classic case of, like, progress and disruption happening at the same time.
Uh,
And it raises some really important questions about, like, who benefits and who loses out when these big technological shifts happen.
It's a question that we're still wrestling with today as we see new technologies like automation and artificial intelligence transforming the world of work.
It's almost like history is rhyming. So we've got this picture now of Malcolm McLean kind of like shaking up the shipping world. But his story is just one part of a much larger transformation that was happening in global commerce. And to understand the full scope of that transformation, we need to, like, zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What were some of the other forces that were driving the rise of containerization?
Well, one really important factor was the changing nature of global trade itself. After World War II, there was this huge surge in demand for consumer goods, and manufacturers were looking for ways to produce and distribute their products more efficiently. At the same time, you had advances in transportation technology like the development of larger and faster cargo ships. And this created the perfect conditions for a system like containerization to emerge and thrive.
So it's like a confluence of factors.
Yeah.
You've got rising demand, you've got technological advancements, and you've got these visionary entrepreneurs like McLean who are able to see the opportunity and seize it.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that containerization wasn't just an American phenomenon. While McLean was making waves on the East Coast, a company called Matson Navigation was independently developing its own container system on the West Coast.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. So there were like parallel innovations happening at the same time.
Exactly. Matson was focused on the route between California and Hawaii, which presented its own unique challenges because they had to efficiently transport both small consumer goods to the islands and large bulk shipments of sugar back to the mainland.
That makes sense. So how did their approach to container design differ from McLean's?
Well, Matson brought in a physicist to actually conduct rigorous scientific analysis, and they ultimately settled on a 24-foot container that they believed was optimal for their needs. This differed significantly from the 35-foot containers that were favored by McLean's Sealand Company.
Hmm. So now you have these two major players in the container shipping game, each using different container sizes. I can see how that would create problems for what's called intermodal transport, like the ability to seamlessly move containers between trucks, ships, and trains.
Exactly, and this is where the issue of standardization becomes absolutely crucial to the success of containerization. Without a common set of standards, the entire system would become fragmented and inefficient. Imagine the logistical nightmare of trying to move containers between different systems that don't fit together.
Yeah, that would be chaos. So how did they manage to get everyone on the same page? How did this idea of like standardized shipping containers actually become a reality?
Well, that's a story in itself, and it's one that Levinson really dives into in the book. It involved a lot of negotiation, a lot of compromise, and even some government intervention.
Sounds like a fascinating story. And I'm sure there were some colorful personalities involved along the way.
Oh, absolutely. There were strong-willed individuals, powerful companies, and government agencies all vying for influence. It was a real battle of ideas and interests.
Okay, so I'm hooked. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into the messy but ultimately successful process of how the world agreed on a standard for the shipping container. Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were talking about how the shipping world was kind of like a Wild West, with different companies using different container sizes, and this was obviously creating a lot of problems for intermodal transport. So how did this whole standardization thing actually happen? Like, who were the key players, and what were the major challenges they faced?
Well, Levinson really does a great job of kind of like unpacking this whole messy process. It wasn't just a matter of like sitting down and agreeing on the dimensions of a box. There were so many different interests at play. You had shipping companies who had invested heavily in their own container systems. You had railroads who were trying to figure out how to integrate containers into their operations. And you had government agencies who were trying to promote both efficiency and safety.
So it sounds like a real like tug of war between all these different stakeholders.
It absolutely was. And Levinson describes some pretty heated debates and negotiations. Like, for example, one of the big sticking points was the width of the container. Some companies wanted to stick with the standard 8-foot width that was common for truck trailers, but others argued that a wider container would be more efficient for shipping goods overseas.
I can see that would be a tough decision.
It was. And ultimately, it was the government that stepped in and kind of like forced a compromise. They basically said, look, if you want to participate in international trade, you're going to have to use a standard container size. And that really was the turning point.
It sounds like the government played a pretty crucial role in the whole standardization process.
They did. And not just in the U.S., but internationally as well. The International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, played a key role in developing and promoting global standards for shipping containers. And without that kind of international cooperation, it's hard to imagine how containerization could have spread as quickly and as widely as it did.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got this picture now of like the shipping industry coming together and agreeing on a standard container size. But what about the actual logistics of moving those containers around? Like, how did they develop the infrastructure to handle all these boxes?
Well, that's where the real innovation came in. Because it wasn't enough to just have standardized containers. You also needed the equipment to load and unload them efficiently. And that's where things like container cranes and specialized container ships really came into play.
Oh, yeah, those massive cranes that you see at ports.
Exactly. Those were a game changer. because they allowed ships to be loaded and unloaded much more quickly and efficiently than ever before. And as containerization spread, ports around the world started investing in this new infrastructure, which in turn made it even easier and more cost-effective to ship goods by
It's
container.
like a virtuous cycle.
Exactly.
So we've talked about the standardization of containers, and we've talked about the development of the infrastructure to handle them. But what about the human element in all of this? Like, how did the workers who actually loaded and unloaded the ships adapt to this new way of doing things?
Well, that's a really important part of the story, and it's one that Levinson doesn't shy away from. Because the truth is that containerization had a profound impact on the lives of dock workers around the world.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like, their jobs must have changed dramatically.
They did. Before containerization, dock work was very labor intensive. It involved a lot of manual lifting and carrying, and it was often dangerous work. But with containerization, a lot of that work became automated. Cranes and forklifts could now do much of the heavy lifting, and as a result, the number of dock workers needed at ports declined significantly.
So it sounds like containerization led to job losses in the shipping industry.
It did, and that was a source of a lot of conflict and tension, especially in the early days of containerization.
I bet.
Dockworkers' unions fought hard to protect their members' jobs, and there were a number of strikes and protests in ports around the world.
So how did those conflicts get resolved?
Well, it was a long and complicated process, but in many cases, the unions were able to negotiate agreements with shipping companies that provided some level of job security for their members. For example, some agreements guaranteed that a certain number of dock workers would still be employed even as automation increased. Other agreements provided for retraining programs to help dock workers transition to new jobs in the shipping industry.
So it sounds like there was no easy solution.
No, there wasn't. But ultimately, both sides realized that they needed to find a way to adapt to this new reality. And that meant finding ways to balance the benefits of efficiency with the needs of workers.
It's a theme that we see over and over again throughout history. New technologies come along, they disrupt industries, and they create both winners and losers.
Exactly. And it's always a challenge to figure out how to manage that disruption in a way that benefits everyone.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the origins of containerization, the standardization process, the impact on infrastructure and labor. But there's still one more piece of the puzzle that I want to explore, and that's the broader impact of containerization on the world. Like, how did this seemingly simple invention end up transforming global trade and the way we live our lives today?
That's a great question, and it's one that we'll delve into in more detail after the break.
All right, so we're back, and before the break, we were talking about the impact of containerization on dock workers and like how this new technology led to job losses and a lot of conflict and tension. But now I want to kind of like zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Like, how did containerization transform the global economy? What were some of the long-term consequences of this invention?
Well, I think one of the most significant impacts of containerization was that it really lowered the cost of shipping goods around the world. Before containerization, shipping was really expensive
Mm.
because it involved a lot of manual labor and a lot of time wasted loading and unloading ships. But with containerization, those costs plummeted, and that made it possible for businesses to source goods from all over the world, which in turn led to lower prices for consumers.
So it was like a win-win for businesses and consumers.
Yeah, pretty much. And it also had a huge impact on globalization because it made it much easier and cheaper for companies to set up global supply chains. They could now manufacture goods in one country, ship them to another country for assembly, and then sell them in a third country, all at a fraction of the cost that it would have taken before containerization.
So containerization was like a key enabler of globalization.
Absolutely.
But globalization has also had its critics, people who argue that it's led to job losses in developed countries and environmental damage from all the shipping that's going on.
Yeah, those are valid concerns. And I think it's important to acknowledge that containerization has had both positive and negative impacts. It's not a simple story.
Right. It's like any technological innovation. There are always trade-offs.
Exactly.
So I guess the question is like, how do we maximize the benefits of containerization while also mitigating the negative impacts?
Well, I think one key is to focus on sustainability. The shipping industry is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to find ways to make shipping more environmentally friendly. That could mean investing in new technologies like electric ships or biofuels, or it could mean optimizing shipping routes to reduce fuel consumption.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about the issue of job losses? Like, how do we make sure that the benefits of containerization are shared more broadly?
Well, I think one way is to invest in education and training programs to help workers transition to new jobs in the global economy. We need to make sure that people have the skills they need to compete in a world where technology is constantly changing.
Yeah, that's really important. I think we're starting to see that happen now with the rise of online learning platforms and things like that.
Right. And I think we're also going to see a lot of innovation in the shipping industry itself. As technology continues to evolve, we're going to see new ways to automate shipping, to make it more efficient, and to reduce its environmental impact.
So it sounds like the story of containerization is still being written.
It absolutely is. And it's a story that's going to continue to unfold for many years to come.
Well, I think this has been a really fascinating conversation. It's amazing to think about how much impact a simple invention like the shipping container has had on the world.
It really is.
And it's a reminder that innovation can come from unexpected places, and that even the simplest ideas can have profound consequences.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the box. I hope you learned something new, and that you'll continue to think about the impact of technology on our world. Until next time,
Hmm.
happy diving.